And it's quite a large number of microbes of different types that live on the plant, anywhere from about 10,000 per square centimeter to about 10 million or more per square centimeter. So basically, everything we see is covered with microbes, and certainly everything that we eat that's green is going to be covered with quite a large number of microbes.
Welcome to the Wild Herbs Podcast, where we unpack and uncover the healing properties of wild herbs so you can heal naturally with the plants beneath your feet. I am your host, April Punsalan, wild untamed plant lady, also a botanist, an ethnobotanist, and herbalist dedicated to teaching you how to heal with plants. If you want to learn edible and medicinal plants, you are in the right place, my friend. Before we dive right in, I have to let you know that registration for our signature course, Medical Botany 1, opens January 29th, 2025 this year, and the course will start on February 12th. And you definitely want to sign up if you want to learn how to identify wild herbs in the field, work with wild herbs that are widely underused by many herbalists, and learn to strengthen your skills in herbal medicine making and empower yourself to heal your body, your families, and your friends. All right, I hope to see you in the course. Let's dive right in. You are in for a special treat today because today's guest, Dr. Stephen E. Lindow, is an expert on the Phyllosphere, which is the microbiome of leaves. Stephen, thank you so much for being on the Wild Herb Podcast today.
My pleasure.
So before we jump in on the Phyllosphere, let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Stephen Lindow. He is a distinguished American plant pathologist and microbial ecologist, renowned for his pioneering research on plant-associated bacteria. Influenced by his family's farming background, he earned a bachelor's in botany from Oregon State University, and he completed his PhD in plant pathology. And so throughout his career, he studied the ecology of the microbiome of leaves, the Phyllosphere, and he's provided invaluable insights onto the plant microbe interactions that he's going to tell you all about. And he's an expert, so I'm super excited to have you because I am just, to be honest, learning about the Phyllosphere, and it's extremely fascinating. So I'm very grateful that you are going to teach us. And Dr. Lindow is a professor, and so you are a teacher, and so this is what you do as a career. Thank you for coming and spending your time with us. You obviously are an expert on the Phyllosphere, which we're going to talk about. Before I start asking you questions about the Phyllosphere, I would love if you could tell listeners, what is the Phyllosphere?
The Phyllosphere is the microbiome that covers the aerial parts of plants around the world. Basically all living things are covered with microbes, and both the aerial parts of plants as well as the roots of plants, which is called the rhizosphere, which is actually things that are much better known than the actual leaf surface microbiome. So the microbiome of aerial plants like flowers and leaves and stems, it would be then the phyllosphere. And it's quite a large number of microbes of different types that live on the plant, anywhere from about 10,000 per square centimeter to about 10 million or more per square centimeter. So basically, everything we see is covered with microbes, and certainly everything that we eat that's green is going to be covered with quite a large number of microbes.
It's fascinating. I was reading about how leaves can have thousands and thousands of bacteria in a tiny area. I don't know. I forget the direct number, and I know it probably depends on the plant, but it's fascinating to think about. Would you say that one leaf could have 1 million species of bacteria?
In terms of the numbers of different types of bacteria, it's hard to know. It varies a lot from plant to plant. There's a wide variety. There's probably thousands of different types on a given leaf. Millions, I'm not so sure, but at least thousands. Actually, hard to tell certain microbes apart, but they will have subtle differences, so we'll call them different.
Okay, so thousands. So it's safe to say that on one leaf, you could have thousands of bacteria on that leaf.
thousands of different types of bacteria, adding up to millions of total individuals.
Okay, so thousands of different species?
Yes.
Whoa, totaling up to 1 million potential if you don't count the species. We're just saying bacteria in total. That's mind blowing. And so, how did you get started researching the Phyllosphere?
A long story, but when I was in graduate school a long time ago in Wisconsin, I discovered certain species of bacteria that were apparently coming from leaves that had the ability to catalyze ice formation. Water is a liquid that we normally think of as freezing at 0 degrees Celsius, 32 degrees Fahrenheit. And our work showed, though, that it wasn't really true. It's been known for a long time that water will supercool, remain in the liquid state to quite cold temperatures. And so certain bacterial species that I found that were associated with plants have this ability to catalyze ice formation. They act as a trigger, and the water will not remain liquid in the presence of these bacteria when it gets cold. And in fact, ice crystals are formed.
Hmm.
So this was something that I discovered as part of my earlier work. And it turns out to be very important in terms of plant health because freezing is a very major problem to especially a lot of our agricultural crops that are grown in cold places where they don't normally have evolved. And so these bacteria that live on plants catalyze ice that triggers the damaging ice formation that causes frost damage to plants.
And so that's how you started to study basically, could you say the microbiome of leaves or plants on the outer external surface
Exactly, yeah,
of the
because
sphere?
the leaves seem to be the major reservoir of these bacteria that are very important in various
Mhm.
processes. And so we are very interested in who else are growing with them and ways that we might manipulate that particular species because it is damaging to plants because they cause the ice formation that causes damage to flowers and fruits and what have you.
And so, probably just like our microbiome, I'm guessing that there's these beneficial bacteria that live on the leaves and then probably maybe harmful. How does the Phyllosphere affect the health of the plant, this
Very important,
microbiome?
very good question. Yes, there are potential plant pathogens that live on the plants, even though they aren't necessarily diseased at a given time. The plant surface acts as a reservoir of these potential plant pathogens, and under the right conditions of weather conditions or damage to the plant, they can invade the plant. It's very much like when we get a cut on our skin, we often get a minor infection by Staph aureus. And Staph aureus is common on our leaf, on our plant leaf all the time. Same thing happens with plants, that plants are covered with potential plant pathogens and they are there ready to strike if you would.
Mm.
Same time, most of the bacteria actually on plants are not plant pathogens, and they actually have a beneficial role. So just like our human microbiome helps protect us against pathogens, that also seems to be the case with plant surfaces, that the main role of most microbes on a plant is to live and do their thing on the plant. And in so doing, they help act as a barrier, if you would, to the invasion by those plant that
Mm.
also be there.
So they act as a barrier to the plant pathogens. It's the same in our body. Do they help the plant photosynthesize better? Do they help the plant get nutrients better?
There's some evidence that plants benefit from these other bacteria that aren't pathogens. It's unclear exactly why. They probably help the plant immune system. Plants can help defend
Mm.
themselves against pathogens as well. And so one of the roles of these other beneficial bacteria is to stimulate the plant immune system and make it a little bit more robust to their defense against plant pathogens. But they also produce hormones that the same plants do. So auxins and gibberellins that are normal in the development of plants are hormones that certain bacteria have also evolved to produce. And they condition the way that plants develop, it would appear, by causing a change in the way the plants grow and to defend themselves against pathogens. So there's a variety of different ways in which the bacteria tweak the plant, if you would, and making it somewhat different than it would be if it was naive. They actually make the very same hormones that the plant makes, and they're probably doing it for a couple of reasons to tweak the plant into making it a better home for the
Mm,
microbiome. But at the same time, it also benefits the plant and again, conferring some resistance to pathogens.
that's fascinating. It reminds me of our own biology. 70% of our immune health is tied to the gut
Yeah,
microbiome. So, what type of microorganisms, because it's not just bacteria, right? What kind of microorganisms are typically on leaves?
there's a variety of different microbes on leaves. Bacteria are by far the most numerous. If you were to
Mm,
simply count the number of different cells, bacteria by far are the most numerous, but bacteria are also much smaller than fungi or yeast. And so there
mhm.
are a variety of different fungi or yeast on plants. In terms of the number of individual cells, they're maybe 100 or 1,000 times small number. But because they're so large, there's actually a relatively large biomass of different types of fungi and yeast. There's also some protists, the microbes that can eat other microorganisms that are on the plant. But bacteria are probably the most common, the most numerous, and probably the ones having the biggest effect on the plant.
Very interesting. And so, have you noticed through your research, because you're looking at this bacteria on these leaves, that plants and more natural environments have more diversity of microbes compared to a plant that you're studying that is in an agriculture setting, that is being, maybe it's a plant in a monoculture, on a monoculture farm, versus a plant that's in this natural ecosystem that's surrounded by diversity? How do their phyllospheres differ?
That's a really interesting question and one that we've been really focusing on lately. In that, you're right, in that when we have large agricultural fields which are homogeneous and
Hmm.
no other plants around, we think that it may be somewhat impoverished by the types and even maybe even the numbers of microbes that can be on it. Because you have to think that leaves are out there, they're an open environment. They have to become contaminated, if you would. Question is, where do the microbes come from that end up on the plant? And it would appear that most of them arise from transfer from other plants nearby. Probably come from soils, but it's also thought that the microbes that live on plants have special adaptations that allow them to survive the plant surface. Because the plant is a stressful environment because it's frequently dry and there's sunlight with ultraviolet light. So it's a stressful condition, we think. And the microbes that live on the plant surface are thought to have special features that allow them to survive or maybe even modify the leaf surface a bit to make it possible to live there. So it seems like the primary source of the microbes that you find on the plant surface are from other plants. And you're right that if you're in a homogeneous cornfield, you're going to have a very different community of plants around you, the
Hmm.
plants, as opposed to a more natural setting with a diversity of plant species.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I was reading how plants that have a more diverse ecosystem tend to have more diversity in bacteria. And the less that you impact the soil and you're manipulating the environment, the more diversity in the microbiome you're going to have, for instance, in your yard. So it made me think about my yard, because my yard, a lot of it is wild. I try to keep it wild. And I like to think that the plants in my yard have a healthy microbiome on their leaves compared to if I had planted a bunch of, I don't know, azaleas and just non-native plants from Japan, from Lowe's. So it's fascinating to think about that these plants that have more diversity in the ecosystem are going to have a more diverse microbiome on their leaves and in the rhizosphere.
Yeah, it's almost certainly the case. What the effect of that would be, it's still less than clear many times, but it's almost
Yeah,
that there will be a difference in the microbiology.
definitely. I remember so I got my master's of science and I did this little, it was a field day for ecology students, and we were studying the microbiome of roots. And I did some samples of English ivy from a field. And then I did some samples of these goldenrod and different species in this field. And I was looking at fungi. and I stained it. And if it had fungi, it was supposed to be a blue. I wasn't getting it to species. I was just looking for presence or absence. And on the English ivy, there was none. There was no mycorrhizae. And then on that field with the goldenrods and all the wildflowers, every sample had mycorrhizae. And so that made me think about what's happening below ground too, and that one species, especially a non-native species, is going to decrease the mycorrhizae in the soil and the microbial community overall. Scientists were really starting to look below ground as to why plants are able to be invasive. And that was a big thing, looking at the microbial community.
Yeah, it's probably the case that roots and microbes have more intimate association. Because you have to think about plant anatomy and that leaves are covered with a thick cuticle, a waxy layer that keeps water from being lost and also acts as a bit of a barrier to pathogens. But roots can't have a cuticle because they're there to absorb water and nutrients and so on. And the roots also leak a lot more nutrients out into the world that support a much larger microbial community than do the leaves. The leaves are a armored surface, if you would. So certainly there's a lot of microbes on a leaf surface, but on a unit area basis, there's actually even more on a root, and roots are probably much more responsive to them than those on the leaf.
That's interesting. So it seems that there's growing interest in microbiology. And as a microbiologist and a plant pathologist, have you seen this trend, and where do you think science is going to go? Or do you think we're going to keep learning more and more about this exciting field of microbiology?
Oh, definitely. There's a lot of questions that are just now being asked. So there's a lot of new tools to look at these plants and certainly a lot of molecular genetic tools to decipher what's really going on. It's not enough to just know who's there, but you also need to know what they're doing and what
Hmm.
traits that they need and what's beneficial to a plant or a human and which ones are deleterious. Yeah, we have a lot better tools, and even when I started my career, that make it exciting to think about the questions we can ask now that we couldn't before.
Yeah, that is exciting. And do you notice, because I study a lot plant families. Being a botanist, I like to look at the Lamiaceae, the Asteraceae, and have you noticed that these different plant families have signature Phyllospheres or signature microbiomes? Because the mints, for example, have a ton of essential oils. So I'm thinking that may influence which bacteria can survive or thrive versus an aster, which has a ton of terpenoids. So looking at the signature of these plants and how that's influencing the microbiome.
There's been some work in that area. A lot of that has been actually been done by scientists in Greece. Some former members of my lab and others in Greece have done a lot of work of that because a lot of aromatic plants live in these Mediterranean areas. And as you say, some of these volatile oils and what have you are antimicrobial. We know that clove oil and other things certainly can be, but it's thought that many of these aromatic things that we like for smell are actually having an effect on selecting who can actually also live on those same plants. A lesser effect might be happening on plants that we don't associate with volatiles, but certainly there is a host specificity. Like
Mm.
plants select for certain groups of microbes. Other microbes are relatively cosmopolitan, but a particular plant species tends to have a bit of a unique community that's similar but slightly different and maybe even shared with its neighbors.
That's cool. Thank you. I know your expertise isn't necessarily in people foraging wild herbs and eating them, but you definitely have a lot of knowledge on the microbiome of leaves. How do you feel? Because people will always ask me, do you wash the leaves? And I know all of our produce, even organic in the grocery store, is dipped in a chlorine solution to get rid of the bacteria. How do you feel about people foraging and eating leaves in the field? What kind of precautions should foragers be taking?
Most of our edible greens, for example, are grown with very special care to avoid the contamination by the kind of things you wouldn't want to be eating. So a lot of human pathogens like Salmonella and E. coli and some others can be a real big hazard if you were to eat them. And so if in California, which is a major source of a lot of these green vegetables, there are very strict restrictions on where and how you grow these plants to avoid these contamination.
Mhm.
If you were not, if you're collecting plants that were grown without such care, there's a risk that you would be picking up some of these contaminants, especially if you were picking things in a wild area that might be near, say, an animal production area where cattle or something were being grown. It's quite
Mm.
possible that they may be contaminated with pathogens that you would not want to be consuming.
That's smart. I'm thinking about in my own yard, and I work with a lot of students and members that forage, let wild plants grow in their yard. And I typically just rinse my leaves off with water. I don't do a vinegar rinse soap. I just do a rinse with water. A lot of times I'm sauteing them, but I notice that when I eat them fresh, I think my microbiome benefits a little bit more. I notice my health improves. I try to eat 2 cups of greens per day. Do you think that rinsing the greens off with water, still a lot of the beneficial bacteria or the microbiome remains on the leaves?
It's actually very difficult to wash microbes from the leaves.
Okay.
They are very small, they're very difficult to dislodge. They often have attached themselves to the plant surface. And when we study them, we have a lot of effort to scrub them off. We use
Mm.
sonic vibrations to release them. So washing really is not going to do a very good job of removing them at all.
Okay.
The other thing that I was going to mention, though, that when you're collecting vegetation for consumption, especially in an urban area, you're getting a lot of things that you don't recognize. There's a lot of airborne pollutants that also
Mm.
collect on leaves. So think of
Mm.
the little bits of tires that are worn down from the street in front of your house. In California, we don't get much summer rain. And so by the end of the summer, almost all plants are covered with dust. And that dust
Mm.
in an urban area is not things you want to eat.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of pollutants from everything else. Like I say, tires, I know, are one of the major airborne pollutants in a lot of urban areas. And it's known that some of these bits of tire are not something that you want to be eating, but you would if you did
Mm.
a job of trying to remove it. Yes, there are other inorganic materials that come along with any microbes that would be on plants in an urban area.
Inorganic, like the tire dust?
I'm just picking on tire dust as a good culprit, but there's a lot of pollutants that might be from industrial sources and so on. It's also, there was a very interesting study a few years ago by a colleague of mine, Noah Fear at Colorado State. And he was interested in the airborne microbiome, which we think is important in the immigration of microbes to a plant. And what he was finding was that, especially in cold places in the wintertime, there is quite a large amount of microbes from animal feces that are in the air and they would get onto plant surfaces. So think about taking dogs out for a walk and they're doing their duty on here and there. It turns out that there is an awful lot of airborne dispersal of dog poop, as an example. So especially in an urban area where you're going to have a lot of these sources, this is other things that you could expect to be on plant surfaces.
So the dog poop that's circulating in the air, if it's trying to attach to a leaf, though, if the microbiome of the leaf is thriving, could it stop that, or would it eat it, the harmful pathogens?
It's quite likely that it would not multiply very much. The microbe
Mm-hmm.
would act as a bit of a prophylaxis to growing of them, but they would accumulate there, just like dust accumulates on surfaces. Many of these microbes might be sufficiently robust that they would hang out even in a dormant state until you came along and ate it. Just something to think about, that there is the potential for contamination, especially like I say, in urban areas or even rural areas when you're next to sources of airborne microbes that you wouldn't want to necessarily be eating.
Yes, it's a good point. I'm hoping that with the rinsing, the bath, the water bath, I'd be getting any particulate matter off, hopefully. Like tire dust, dog urine. Although I do have a dog, but I know his little spots. And he won't use the bathroom even in the yard, which is awesome. He has to go for a walk. It's a, and then we always clean up. We always clean up after him, but I am more of a liberal forager than a lot of people where I will forage. I feel like the benefit of me foraging wild herbs outweighs the negative side of it. And so that's what I do because I feel like the more, like how you're saying, the more diverse the plant's microbiome is, and the ecosystem outside, the more diverse and healthy really the microbiome in the plants are. And so I think about it the same way for my body. The more plant diversity I eat, the healthier my microbiome will be, and then
Not,
the healthier I'll be.
not just the microbiome, but you're getting some unique phytochemicals from eating wild plants too that wouldn't necessarily be in our vanilla lettuce and whatever that most of the rest of us eat. But yeah, I
Mm.
think it's these phytochemicals that have been more than anything, along with the microbiome they would provide, are probably very beneficial.
Yeah, that's really true. Yeah, because the wild herbs have way more phytochemicals than the store-bought plants, unfortunately, because a lot of them have been bred out because we don't like bitter and pungent and yeah. So, ask you another question, not so much directly tied to research that you've done, but from your experience. And this is getting to what we were just talking about. So, given your research on the living organisms on plants, the Phyllosphere, and the microbiome, do you have any opinion on how humans, as we are a living microcosm of the microcosm, do you have any opinions as to the microbiome of humans in modern countries and health diseases and from what you've seen in plants?
The role of plants in this whole phenomenon that you mentioned, the probiotics and all that we eat, I think it's certainly a very big deal. And
Hmm.
there's been a lot of nice studies that show that there's a very big effect of people's diet on their gut microbiome. And so going to other areas where they don't eat a lot of processed foods and so on, it's very clear that what we eat has such a large effect. And there's been a lot of work on fermented foods because fermented foods are a very rich source of microbes. They're microbes that might well do well in our guts because they were grown under conditions that are similar to that might be found in the anaerobic guts of our bodies. I think it's going to be interesting to know to what extent certain of the microbes that would be on a fresh green plant are going to enter into our microbiome.
Mhm.
Certain of the microbes that are found on plants are species that, in principle, could grow well in our gut. There are relatives of E. coli and all these, what we call enteric microbes, that are facultative anaerobes. They can grow under conditions of low oxygen, which would be typical of our gut. And so it's quite possible that some of the things that we eat on green plants would persist in our body as such, as a member of our human gut microflora. But I don't think there's been an awful lot of that done. More and more of that's been associated with fermented foods. And there you
Mhm.
get one extra link. So you take cabbage and you grind it up and you turn it into kimchi or you turn it into sauerkraut and then you eat it. So some of those microbes that you're eating from the fermented food came originally from the living plant surface. And they persisted through the fermentation process. And ultimately, some of those might also persist in our guts after we eat them. So, a long chain of things that have to happen. And you're eating a green, non fermented plant, you're skipping a couple of those steps.
Mhm.
See, all right. But in principle, some of the things that we eat might persist in our gut and have a beneficial or detrimental effect.
And so, how many species are anaerobic? Like, how many on a given, and I know it probably varies greatly. The one that I know, and everyone knows, we know lactobacillus, and that's a common one. But, and I'm a botanist, I'm not a microbiologist, but I'm just curious, how many anaerobic beneficial bacteria could be on a leaf that would survive through the fermentation process.
You mentioned lactobacillus, that's a
Mm-hmm.
classic.
Mm-hmm.
But there are others like Pentoya and others. These are what we call facultative anaerobes. They can grow under aerobic environments, but they also can grow under anaerobic environments. And the lactobacillus that you mentioned would be a classic example of something that is found on plants, not in particularly high abundance. And there's a couple of reasons why that might be true. But it would be there and it would thrive then under anaerobic conditions when other organisms that require oxygen for growth would not be able to persist. So when you make sauerkraut or something, the large diversity of microbes that might once have been on that plant, most of them are eliminated or outgrown by things like lactobacillus as it became anaerobic, as they consumed the oxygen during the fermentation process. The others would be excluded, if you would, and their numbers would be there, but they'd be very small. Only those that could grow under the anaerobic conditions would be present. The fraction of microbes on a plant that are potential anaerobes, facultative anaerobes, I don't know, but it's probably a small percentage, maybe 10 or 20%.
10 or
But
20%. And maybe like how many different species from a low to a high number could you have?
there's a large diversity. The first thing you got to know about microorganisms, they're incredibly diverse.
Mm-hmm.
And even within a given species, if you call them, there may be lots and lots of variation. It's hard to say how many species there are
Right.
on a soil or anything, but it's a large number. Like I say, there's thousands of different genetically distinct strains on a given leaf. Some of those would be grouped together and we would call them species, but
Mm.
a very large diversity. That's a thing you should try to keep in the back of your mind.
Because it's hard to get it to species. You don't,
There's
so like,
there are different ways to call things species.
mm,
You remember your biology. Species are things that sexually recombine, but microorganisms that don't typically undergo sex, that's not a
mm,
way we can even start to imply a species that they are the same and they interact with themselves. They don't. They're all very diverse, and we kind of group them taxonomically by things that are genetically similar enough. We'll call them a species, but it's not very helpful. Yeah.
maybe like a group, like you have these groupings
Yeah. That's
of similar microbes, I
I'll
think.
buy that. I'll buy that one.
I saw a paper and it didn't have, like you're saying, I guess I understand now why it's hard to call them species because they're not sexually reproducing, but they had little color coding for the different groups of microbes. And so maybe, yeah, I can see how you have to do a lot of lumping when you're a microbiologist.
Yep, that's a very good way to think of it. Functionally, the way it's done is by looking at the entire genome sequence, things that are 95% similar or more is thought to be in the same species or group. But again, there are so many possible differences that it ends up in the thousands and thousands.
Fascinating. And I was reading, and I don't know if you have any opinions on this, which I'm sure you know because you understand bacteria, that our bacteria, they're multiplying and they can change in an hour, in a day, depending on what we're eating. And so because they're reproducing so fast, asexually reproducing, that what we do in a given day can influence the next group that's reproducing in our colon and our stomach. And so, have you seen that, like the microbiome and how it changes so fast in relationship to temperature, water, or anything that you're studying that the plant is doing, or stress to the plant, and the microbiome is changing really fast and rapidly? Because I'm just thinking about, in terms of what we do in our day to day, how we're probably influencing our microbiome by our daily decisions, just to get an understanding for how incredible these organisms are and how fast they multiply. Can you give listeners just an idea of how they do multiply and change according to stresses or environmental factors? I know that's a big question, but
Yeah. Mike, I think of microorganisms opportunistic. Again, we saw there's a wide variety of microbes there. Many of them on a plant surface may not be doing very much on a given day, but let's say a heavy rain comes. My former boss in the University of Wisconsin, Chris Upper, and his group showed that under heavy rain conditions, certain pathogens just explode. There was something about the change in the environment associated with heavy rain kind of forcing the microbe into the plant, probably, that they now had a new condition that they could quickly exploit and their numbers would
mm,
exponentially increase. Double, many microbes can double in number every hour or two. And so you can imagine that if things were to change and an organism that had a capability of exploiting that new condition, they can.
mm,
So there's probably a lot of growing and dying going on all the time that's driven by what the nature of that environment might be. On a plant, it might be if it was damaged or if it was kept wet for a long time, or if it was warm, only organisms that do well under warm conditions are going to exploit. So there's probably always some transition in terms of who the winners are at a given time and a given place.
very fascinating. Just to think about that they are growing exponentially within an hour or two, you said?
They can't do that
Can.
forever, obviously, or the world will be taken over by microbes, but they have the potential to react quickly to particular environmental stimuli that they like.
Fascinating. Is there anything that you think that listeners should know about the Phyllosphere of leaves that we didn't touch on?
No, it's just something that it's something almost nobody really recognizes, that when they're eating green vegetables uncooked, they're eating a large number of microbes along with it. Again, we're in the United States, we have processes and regulations that make it safe to do so, eating uncooked vegetables. But in many parts of the world where there aren't these kind of conditions and there's a lot less, there's more laxity in terms of cleaning your hands and keeping your animals out of the field and all, there is real risk about eating uncooked vegetables that would bring you in contact with potential pathogens and so on.
Yeah, and then your body's not used to those, right? Because some people in those countries could eat that and not have an effect, whereas us coming in, it can negatively impact our digestive systems. And that could be because we have a different signature, a microbiome signature.
Yeah, it's almost certainly people have a bit more tolerance of some of these potential pathogens, but I also hear though that there's a lot of gastrointestinal illnesses in countries where we certainly would suffer if we were to eat there. They do too.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's true. Yeah, I myself have traveled abroad and have gotten lax towards the end of my travels and have eaten fruit off the side of the road from people selling it and had little issue. It clears up. I've never had a long-lasting problem, but I do know of people that have traveled have had long-lasting problems with harmful bacteria, digestive issues. Yeah, it's important to know and to be mindful, especially as you said, when you're traveling abroad and you don't know how the food or the produce has been taken care of. But thank you so much for introducing us to the Phyllosphere, the microbiome on leaves. And I really appreciate your time. It's such a fascinating field of study.
My pleasure.
I will put a link at the bottom of the show notes for Dr. Stephen Lindow's paper on the Phyllosphere. So I recommend reading that and getting more knowledge about the microbiome on leaves. Thank you so much, Dr. Stephen Lindow, for coming and thank you for your time and thank you for listening.
No problem. Have a good one.
Thank you. Wow, the Phyllosphere. I hope you enjoyed that podcast. And just so you know that eating a diversity of wild herbs in the field and rinsing the leaves off is so beneficial for your microbiome and your overall health. And I hope to have someone on the Wild Herb podcast soon that can explain to you better than I can the importance of eating wild herbs to improve your gut brain health. All right, learn wild herbs. And don't forget, Medical Botany 1 opens registration January 29th, and the course will start February 12th. I hope to see you in there. Empower yourself, friend.